All right, Mopar people, welcome back to the channel. I'm just Mopar Joe. Today's video is about how a Transbrake is probably not going to help your car launch. Here's why. Before we get into that, let me show you one quick pass of my car from a few years back when I had my old engine in. And I want you to kind of watch the suspension real quick. After seeing that, I want you to kind of look at, and I'll throw a picture up here, of how the front suspension is really stretched out, elongated. It kind of falls out of the wheel wells. My car's a foot brake car. I've always ran foot brake classes. Pro, they call it sometimes, instead of super pro. No electronics, they call it sometimes. I don't actually want to run a Transbrake. And the main reason would be that I need to change up my suspension. So it's oftentimes not as easy as you think to do. A lot of guys seem to think I'll put a Transbrake in my car and it'll go faster. Technically, it can go faster. I'm not saying that it's impossible, but I'm saying if you put a Transbrake in a perfect foot brake car, the majority of times it won't do anything. Or it will launch a little harder, but the suspension is not actually set up for that Transbrake. What a Transbrake does is immediately, when you let off the button, smacks that rear end and rear gear with all of that force at one time, where the suspension is totally neutral instead of being loaded up, and causes the car to jump then off the line. The foot brake car like mine, you can see it inching forward, inching forward. It's sitting there with all the suspension loaded. And then whenever the converter flashes and I let my foot off the brake, I put the gas pedal down, the car leaves and it transfers weight. So it relies on the momentum and the force from the converter to actually push the car forward and for it to launch. The Transbrake car, you could have a multitude of different converter in it, and you could even have the wrong converter a lot of times, and it will still launch. I've got an old video of my orange car that the suspension was basically set up to foot brake, and you can watch it launch here. So yes, one major thing that was different, that car was a tube chassis car. It had a Mustang 2 front end with coil springs, and the front end travel was limited in it. So meaning that those front wheels and tires did not fall out of the wheel wells whenever it took off. It only extended, I think, 3 or 4 inches, where my purple car now extends a lot more with just a stock style front torsion bar suspension. Yes, I can limit this, and I probably will, to kind of play with my 60 foot some. But I haven't made it to that point yet. So currently the car's underpowered. I don't think it needs limiting like that. And if I had a Transbrake, I could try to play with that some and set up the suspension. But in a car one that does not hook already, a Transbrake's not going to help you. You're going to be trying to put 3,500 RPM worth of force through that converter immediately when you let off that button, and it's going to load the suspension and it's going to break the tires loose. Or it's going to wheel hop. All of that is a violent reaction to what's happening whenever you let off the button. So don't let anyone tell you, yeah, just throw a Transbrake in there, the car's going to pick up. Technically, yes, it will, but also, no, it won't. If you can't tune that suspension, it's not going to happen. Something else to consider, and we look at Dave Morgan's chassis book, it mentions that a lot of racers, especially running a Pro Tree, look for that very low gear ratio to be able to get off the line. From my experience, Transbrakes typically like that low gear and a lot of traction whenever you leave. It gets that immediate jump out like it's supposed to. Other times, if the chassis is not set up correctly or inconsistent conditions, whatever, you could have a poor launch. Something I found very interesting while reading the book was tire spin that's associated with an extra low gear ratio is oftentimes confused as a chassis issue. So a Transbrake, I think, would only exacerbate that in making it worse because it's multiplying that torque and it's hitting faster. Something else to consider when you are transbraking something and bolting that into your transmission, it's a lot harder on parts. So most of the time people have a two-step of some kind that will load the ignition and engine with a lot of extra fuel. As your foot is to the floor and you let off a button, you can hear a lot of times that stutter box of sorts. It's whacking the drivetrain with all that power. So any slack that's in your U-joints, ring and pinion, the splines between your transmission, all that comes out at once and immediately puts that power to the back tire. So if your suspension's not set up correctly, I hate to say it, but the Transbrake's not going to help. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I realize this is kind of a generalization of a video here, but I did want to get the message out. I know there's a lot of guys that are looking forward to transbraking soon, and they may not be ready for it, just like I'm probably not. Thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you next time.